Hey guys, it's Asa from Central Iowa Fishing, and today I'm here to talk to you about spring walleye fishing tips in rivers. Right now is a great time to go get out. Walleye are staging to spawn in anywhere in the central walleye nation, or whatever you want to call it. But walleye begin to stage to spawn when the water temps are steadily about 48 to 62 degrees. And you have to remember that water temperature changes a lot slower than it does on land. They'll begin to feed actively during the day or at night, which is a lot of the times when you find a lot of the bigger walleye in the shallows. And they will take their times to move shallower to feed during the day when they're staging to spawn. First off, I'm going to start off with location. Shallow waters can range from anywhere from 2 to 20 feet when you're targeting those shallow water walleye. They will stage near feeding grounds, places that produce lots of bait fish, crawdad, anything that those walleye are feeding on. Dams produce good feeding structures, good feeding grounds for all staging walleye. Those are big target areas. You want to target slack waters, backwaters, and eddies. Anywhere that those walleye can get a break from the heavy current and will sit there and wait for those bait fish to come by and ambush them. Find those current breaks, guys. Anything from wing dams to underwater structure. Large walleye will position themselves just off of the main current, and they will ambush any kind of prey that comes by. They'll dart out into those waters. So if you can target, they have, especially on dams, they'll have the main current where the water's coming down off the dam, and then it'll come around, and then right there, right off of the main current to the side of the dam is a good target area for walleye. Next, I'm going to get into what to use. And this all depends on water clarity. Use baits that look most natural but are visible to the fish. Springtime brings lots of rain, which means there's lots of runoff into the rivers, which will really decrease that water visibility. First thing I'm going to get into are twister tails. Now this is the Collins 5-inch lunker twister, tipped with a 3/8 ounce jig head. And then I have the Mr. Twister brand chartreuse, tipped with a 3/16 ounce jig head. And using the size of jig head all depends on the depth that you're fishing at, what level you're fishing at, whether you're jigging or whether you're on a flat level just casting and retrieving. And the color of your jig head, you can vary those up. I like to use some of the orange, the pinks, the reds. Those will really they'll resemble an egg, and it looks like a bait fish is taking off with an egg. You can tip this with a lead head, or you can tip this with a floating jig head, which you Carolina rig. And to do that, you're using that to keep that off of the bottom. And around here, where I like to fish for walleye, there's lots of rocks on the bottom, so really keeping that lead head off of those rocks is really key to not getting so many snags and to producing more fish. Next, I'm going to get into the shad baits. First, I'm going to start off with the Berkeley Ripple Shad, tipped with a 3/8 ounce metallic gold jig head. This isn't a perch color. Like I said, you want them to be able to see it, but you also want it to be natural. So a lighter color of whatever kind of bait fish that you have around there that are in those rivers that those walleyes are actively feeding on is what you want to use. And then next I have a Berkeley Havoc Beat Shad. It's ribbed, creates great vibration in the water, and I have this tipped with a floating jig head, and I like to go with the heavier, well not heavier, but the bigger floating jig heads, because I want that to get off the bottom quicker when I'm retrieving it. So I like to use these at just a flat cast and retrieve level, and slow retrievals, giving it, you know, long pauses, especially during the springtime. Like I said, anytime I use a floating jig head, I always Carolina rig it. Next, like the twisters, make them weedless, depending on the underwater structure. So like with these, you can even Texas rig these, or you can continue to Carolina rig these, but I like to use maybe a 2 or a 3/0 hook, and I like to make it weedless depending on what kind of structure is down there. You know, you make it weedless, then the hook set ratio isn't going to be as great, but it's a lot better than getting a snag every other cast. So next I'm going to get into are the crankbaits. Something that will deflect off of rocks, other debris, etc. in the water. So something with a bigger bill, and I like to go something that has lots of vibration and is usually lightly colored, especially around the springtime, because like I said, that water gets a lot murkier. One like the Berkeley Flicker Shad is a great crankbait to use. Has a longer bill on it, which will deflect off of those rocks and other debris a lot better than something like a square bill or even a lipless. You can get these in lots of different colors. This really represents some of the bait fish that are around here, so I like to use this. Next, I'm going to get into the jerk baits. Something with lots of rattle, lots of vibration, just like the crankbaits. Something lightly colored due to the visibility. And I like to use these in shallow waters, so I like to go with a floater, not a slow sinker, not a normal sinker. I like to go with a floater because I can fish these in anything from 4 feet of water to, 12 feet of water, and keep this off of the bottom in those really shallow waters. This is a metallic color. It's just a Rapala original floater. Works great. Like I said, has lots of vibration. Next I'm going to get into our hair jigs. Hair jigs tipped with flukes or even trailers for your spinner baits can work too. Split tails work fine. Minnows, emerald shiners, anything that can resemble kind of a bait fish, and that is almost exclusively used in vertical situations. You don't want to go cast and retrieve a hair jig at a horizontal level. You want to keep this vertical, give it lots of good action. And another thing for vertical, just strictly vertical, you cannot use these in any kind of horizontal cast and retrieve level are bottom bouncers and Lindy Rigs. Tip with a worm or a minnow, depending on the amount of hooks that are on it. They make them in triples, they make them in 2 hooks, and they make them in 1 hook. The 1 hook you want to use for the minnows, and the 2 hooks or the 3 hooks you use with worms or leeches. You troll these at slow speeds. Anything from 2 to 4 miles an hour is about good when you're trolling for them. Or you can even use these in vertical situations like at dams that have enough current to really lift that Lindy rig off of the bottom. How to use them. Jig heads and hair jigs. For vertical jigging, I like to use the moping technique. Moping is basically throwing it out there, letting it sink, and then slowly raising it, reeling back in, and letting it sink back down, giving it almost a fleeing action, but gives it lots of good action in the water, and you can really find the depth that they're at doing that because you're going through various depths in the water. For moping, I almost always use that jig head, almost always in a vertical situation. And if I'm using a floating jig head, I'll give it just a normal cast and retrieve with a very slow retrieve. I'll give it lots of good pauses in the water. I use these Carolina rigs in places where lots of snags are possible. Really keeps that hook off the bottom and can really reduce your snags by numbers, and it does wonders. Use lead heads capable of reaching the bottom, but not too heavy that they get snagged in the rocks or other trees. So if I'm in some shallower waters or have less current, I'll use a smaller jig head than if I'm fishing in deeper waters and have heavier current. Now you want something that's it's not gonna get swept completely away by the current, but you want something that's gonna be slightly off the bottom and it's gonna drift over some structure, especially when you're moping. Crankbaits, they're great for throwing into slack waters, eddies, anything off of the main current. I like to use a slow retrieval and giving it good pauses when I need to float over some of the underwater structure. And jerk baits, great baits to use in the shallows, especially in backwaters. Backwaters, anything with a very slow current, anything that's shallow, these are my go-to. Next, I'm going to get into some of the gear that you're going to want to use. So what I like to use is anything from a 6 to a 6.5 foot rod. I like to use a medium light rod. So this right here is a 6.5 foot medium light rod. It's a Berkeley amp. Works great. It's got great action. You can really feel that bait when it hits the bottom. And a lot of that has to do with the medium light that I like to go with. And a lot of it has to go with the kind of line that you're using. So on this one, I have monofilament, which I like to use to really feel that bottom. But the only downfall to monofilament is that walleye have teeth. So it's going to be a lot easier to cut the line than it would be if you're going to use unifilament or braid. So on this, I have just a 6 foot rod. It's a wrap SXI combo. and I have unifilament on this. So unifilament or braid is probably the best thing to use, just to make sure you're not losing more fish than you are hooking up with. Get this crankbait off of me. Also better hook sets. So, you know, depending on what you're using, say if I'm using a crankbait, I'm going to want something like monofilament. Give it a little bit more bend, a little bit more stretch, really let that hook get set in their mouth. But if I'm using some of these soft plastics, I like to go with braid. I like to use spinning reels. Anything that's going to be able to pick up lots of slack line quickly, especially when you're moping. I like to use anything from 8 to 15 pound test. You're going to want a measuring board or a measuring tape. Almost every state in the country, I'm pretty sure every state in the country has a minimum length keep law to conserve the walleye populations. So in Iowa it's 15 inches. So always make sure to have that. You never know when DNR is going to show up, going to ask to see your fish, and you don't want to get everything taken away. You don't want to break the law. You want to be a good sportsman. So that's all I have for you today, guys. Thanks for watching. Go ahead and hit like and subscribe and tell me how I did.